Hi, this is Josh Kulp for Daf Shevui. We are learning Daf Memchet, page 48 of Masechet Avodah Zarah. Just a side note before we begin, last week here in Yerushalayim, we were host to the Giro d'Italia, the exciting Italian bike race, a historic event in the city of Jerusalem. So you might notice I'm sitting here with my Road to Jerusalem Israel Cycling Academy. I hope you're a big fan of cycling as I was, or I am. It was a very exciting week here. So just to share some good news from the city where I work, Yerushalayim. So we're learning Daf Memchet, and most of Daf Memchet is about the Asherah tree. The Asherah tree is mentioned twice in the book of Devarim, and it comes up elsewhere in the Tanakh. It's a little unclear exactly what it is. In the Bible, it seems that this is some kind of sacred tree that's associated with Canaanite deities. Trees in general may represent protection. They offer shade, food, or fertility. The fruit is a symbol of fertility for the worshiper. In a request to receive that from the deity. In other words, ancient worshippers didn't think that these trees themselves were gods, but that they represented some sort of more abstract god. It's interesting, I think, a little bit to think about trees in our own culture and the mystic, sacred value of trees. There's a few mythical creatures that come to mind, the Lorax, who speaks for the trees. There's the Ents in Lord of the Rings, the trees that can walk and have seen tremendous large amounts of history. There's, of course, the Christmas tree, which I'm not an expert on the origins of the Christmas tree, but this notion, there's the totem pole, which in Native American culture, again, I'm not an expert on it, is some kind of sacred tree. So a lot of cultures have sacred trees. Of course, Jews in rabbinic literature, in the Bible, we have the tree of the tree of knowledge and the tree of life. So we have our own types of sacred trees, but Devarim is quite strict that you are not to worship them, probably out of fear of some kind of syncretism between Israelite religion and pagan religion. For the rabbis, this Asherah is a little unusual. First of all, they weren't familiar with Canaanite worship anymore. There were no Canaanites. So what exactly is an Asherah was a question. We have a Mishnah about that. It's also a little unusual because here you have an idol that's attached to the ground, and generally speaking, things that are attached to the ground, as we've learned, do not become prohibited. So the tree is an exception to that. It's also, trees grow. Most idols, they're made of stone, wood, metal, things like that. They don't grow on their own. Trees, as we know, do grow on their own. They can be cut down and then regrow. So there's all sorts of explorations on these dapim about the particular nature of this idolatrous tree. One of the things that they start to talk about is, how do I know what an Asherah is? There's a Mishnah about that. Is it that people worship the tree, or is there some kind of idol associated with the tree? You can really get the feeling that the rabbis are not all that intimately familiar with these sacred trees, unlike the idols that we've been talking about throughout the Masechet, with which they are much more familiar. Another topic comes up in a Mishnah. There's a bunch of Mishnah out here that talk about the prohibition of deriving benefit from these trees. We know that you're not allowed to derive benefit from idolatry. But what does it mean to derive benefit from a tree? So eating its fruit, clearly that's deriving benefit. What about sitting in its shade? And that sitting in its shade, passing underneath it, brings the Mishnah into the issue of the impurity of idols. And that's a notion that we haven't encountered all that often in the Masechet. When you look in the Bible itself, you'll find the words impurity, tuma, associated with idolatry, but not in the same way that the impurity systems work in with regard to other subjects. The impurity with idols is closer to the impurity associated with murder and sexual prohibitions. These are kinds of impurity that defile the lands and you can't really easily get rid of them. If I have, let's say, I touch a dead body, so I go to the mikveh, I have some stuff sprinkled on me, and I get rid of that impurity. A woman can get rid of her menstrual impurity. If a man has a sexual discharge, he can get rid of that impurity by going to the mikveh. These are types of impurities that naturally occur: death, sex, certain types of animals that aren't all that bad. They're not immoral, but idolatry, murder, and sexual prohibitions such as incest, adultery, are perceived as to be immoral, and they have different types of adultery, different types of impurity. But the rabbis, to a certain extent, use these terms a little more interchangeably and do talk about idolatry defiling in the more normative bodily sense and not the land sense. Rashi and most commentators, though, understand this as kind of the language the rabbis use to keep one away from idolatry. In order to keep you away, they say if you come into contact with idolatry, you will be impure and you'd have to, let's say, wash yourself before you go and eat truma or do something that requires purity. So we're not going to get a lot of that, but I thought it's an interesting development in regards to the laws of idol worship and regards to the laws of impurity, the notion of the defiling nature of idolatry. And the very end of this daf, just a little preview, comes up with a very interesting abstract discussion about, it's called Ze v'Ze Gorem, when there are two causes. And we're going to learn more about this on the next page, but I'll just give you a little preview here. The question comes up, let's say two things cause something, one of which would cause it to be prohibited, and another thing would cause it to be permitted. Do we look at that result as being prohibited or permitted? It's a type of abstract thinking, we've seen a lot of that in the Masechet, that allows us to compare situations that seem to be very different. When we boil them down, we say, look, that case has two causes, one of which is permitted, one of which is prohibited. What's the final result? Is it prohibited, or is it permitted? It's that kind of abstract thinking that's going to take us into the next daf. I hope you enjoy this daf, and good luck. I hope you're enjoying your summer and getting some bike riding in too.